Hello.
The coastal breeze carried a salty tang that clung to my skin as I stood on the balcony, watching the restless waves of the Mediterranean. Italy's Amalfi Coast, with its sun-drenched cliffs and turquoise waters, had always been a haven for our family. Yet, this summer, something felt different, an undercurrent running beneath the surface of our usual familial bliss. "Mom!" Ethan's voice called out behind me, his tone soft but laced with something unspoken. I turned, seeing him framed in the golden glow of the setting sun, his hair tousled from the sea breeze. He was growing into a man, one who held himself with a quiet confidence that I hadn't noticed before. "Yes, Ethan?" I asked, forcing a smile. I gestured toward the waves. "The sea is beautiful tonight, isn't it?" He joined me on the balcony, leaning on the railing just a little too close. "It is," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But you seem far away. Are you okay?" I hesitated. His question, so simple on the surface, carried a weight that made my heart ache. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just lost in thought." Below us, Dan, my husband, was still on the beach, his figure silhouetted against the horizon as he packed up our umbrella and towels. He had always been steady and dependable, but these days there was a distance between us, a growing canyon of silence that neither of us seemed willing to bridge. Ethan's hand brushed mine as he shifted on the railing. It was a fleeting touch, one that could have been innocent, but it sent a shiver through me. "We've been here so many times, but this summer feels different," Ethan said, his gaze fixed on the waves. I swallowed hard. "Different how?" He turned to me, his eyes holding mine in a way that felt too intense, too searching. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just imagining things." I wanted to believe him, but the air between us had shifted. I felt it in every lingering glance, in the way he sought my company more often than he used to. When Dan finally came up from the beach, the spell broke, and I retreated inside, busying myself in the kitchen with dinner preparations. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dynamics of our family were shifting like the tide, and I was powerless to stop it. Dinner was a quiet affair, punctuated only by the clinking of forks on plates and the occasional hum of conversation. Dan talked about his plans for the next day, scouting for a new hiking trail inland, while Ethan nodded absently, barely engaging. I focused on slicing the lemons that grew in abundance just outside our villa. Their sharp citrus scent filled the air, grounding me, even as I felt Ethan's gaze drift toward me every so often. "You'll come with me tomorrow, right?" Dan asked, breaking my reverie. "What?" "To the trail," he said, his tone neutral, but there was a subtle edge to it. "It'll be nice, just the two of us." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course." Dan's gaze lingered on me, his lips pressing into a line before he returned to his meal. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly overshadowed by something more unsettling, a sensation I couldn't yet name. After dinner, Ethan cleared the dishes without being asked. He wasn't one to volunteer for chores, but lately he'd been different. "Thank you, Ethan," I said softly as I wiped the counters. "It's nothing," he replied, but there was a hesitation in his voice. "Can we talk for a minute?" "Of course." I glanced toward the living room where Dan sat engrossed in a travel guide. Ethan gestured toward the terrace, and I followed him outside. The night was cool, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below soothing yet ominous. The moon cast a silvery glow over everything, making the world feel both magical and surreal. Ethan leaned against the railing, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to say this, but I feel like things are changing." I folded my arms, a nervous laugh escaping me. "Things always change, Ethan. That's just life." "That's not what I mean." He turned to face me fully, his expression open and vulnerable in a way that caught me off guard. "I mean between us." My heart skipped a beat. "Ethan, I know it's wrong," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "But I can't stop thinking about you. Ever since we got here, it's like I'm seeing you differently." And Stop. My voice came out sharper than I intended, but it was the only way I could cut through the storm of emotions that his words had stirred. "You don't mean that. You're confused." "I'm not." His voice was steady now, his eyes locked on mine. And I think you've felt it too. Haven't you? I stepped back, the railing pressing against my back as though the sea itself wanted to swallow me whole. This isn't right, I said, my voice trembling. You're my son, Ethan. This can't happen. He reached for my hand, and though I should have pulled away, I didn't. His touch was warm, grounding, yet electric all at once. I know it can't, he whispered. But that doesn't change how I feel. The sound of the sliding glass door opening made us both jump, and I quickly stepped away, my heart pounding. Dan appeared, his brow furrowed. What are you two doing out here? Just talking, I said quickly, my voice too high-pitched to sound casual. Dan looked between us, his expression unreadable, before he nodded. Well, don't stay up too late. We've got an early start tomorrow. Of course, I said, grateful for the interruption. Ethan didn't say another word as he slipped past Dan into the house. I stayed on the terrace, staring out at the moonlit waves, my mind racing. This was my son, the boy I had raised, loved, protected. Yet here I was, standing at the edge of something I didn't understand, and the ground beneath me felt as unstable as the tides. That night, sleep evaded me entirely. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Dan's steady breathing beside me. Each exhale reminded me of the life we'd built together, the years of marriage, the shared dreams, the quiet stability I thought I could count on. But now my mind churned with Ethan's words, his intensity, the undeniable truth in his gaze. By morning, I felt like a hollow shell, my heart heavy with confusion and guilt. Dan, oblivious to my inner turmoil, was already up and packing supplies for our hike. Beautiful day out there, he said, glancing over his shoulder with a rare smile. Clear skies, cool breeze. It's going to be perfect. I nodded absently, pretending to focus on lacing my shoes. Ethan hadn't come downstairs yet, which gave me a momentary reprieve. But the knot in my stomach only tightened with the thought of facing him again. The hike was grueling, the narrow trails winding up steep cliffs with breathtaking views of the sea below. Dan, ever the adventurer, led the way, stopping every so often to point out a particular flower or snap a picture. You've been quiet, he remarked as we paused at an overlook. Just taking it all in, I replied, forcing another smile. Dan seemed satisfied with my response, but as he moved ahead, I lingered, letting the distance between us grow. The sunlight glinted off the water far below, and for a moment, I let the beauty of the landscape distract me from the storm in my mind. But it didn't last. When we returned to the villa that afternoon, Ethan was waiting for us on the terrace. He was barefoot, his shirt unbuttoned, his sun-kissed skin glowing in the afternoon light. He looked relaxed, yet his eyes betrayed the same turmoil that had kept me awake all night. Hey, he said casually, though his gaze lingered on me a little too long. Hey, I replied, my voice tighter than I intended. Dan went straight to the kitchen to grab a drink, leaving us alone. I could feel Ethan's presence like a magnet, drawing me toward him even as every rational part of me screamed to stay away. Can we talk? He asked, his tone low and urgent. Ethan, no. I shook my head, stepping past him toward the stairs. Please, he said, following me. His voice softened, and something in it made me pause. I just need to explain. I turned to face him, keeping my voice firm. There's nothing to explain. What you said last night, whatever you're feeling, it's not real. It's just a phase, something you'll move past. His jaw tightened, and he shook his head. Don't do that. Don't dismiss this like it's nothing. It has to be nothing, I said, my voice breaking despite my resolve. Because anything else is unthinkable. Ethan looked at me with a mixture of frustration and hurt. You feel it too. I know you do. I've seen it in the way you look at me, in the way you avoid me now. Tell me I'm wrong. I opened my mouth to deny it, to shut this down once and for all, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned and fled up the stairs, closing the door to my bedroom behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I leaned against the door, willing myself to calm down. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. I avoided being alone with Ethan, throwing myself into activities with Dan or retreating to my room under the guise of reading or resting. But the tension between Ethan and me was palpable, an unspoken presence that filled every room we entered. One evening, while Dan was out buying groceries, Ethan cornered me in the kitchen. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening," he said, his voice low but determined. "Ethan, stop." I turned away from him, focusing on the pot of pasta boiling on the stove. "Look at me. I can't." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You can't because you know I'm right." "Because it's wrong," I shot back, my voice trembling. "Because I'm your mother, Ethan. This is impossible." "You're my stepmother," he corrected quietly, and the words sent a chill through me. "That doesn't matter," I said, turning to face him at last. "I raised you. I love you, but not like this. It can never be like this." Ethan stared at me, his expression torn between defiance and despair. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want to feel this way. But I do. And pretending it isn't real doesn't make it go away." His honesty cut through me like a blade, but I couldn't let it sway me. "It doesn't matter how you feel," I said, my voice shaking. We can't do this." For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of the conversation pressing down on us like the relentless tide. Then Ethan stepped back, his jaw tightening. "I'll stay away," he said, his voice hollow. "If that's what you want. But don't pretend you don't feel it too." He turned and left, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I gripped the edge of the counter, tears spilling down my cheeks as I tried to steady my breathing. That night, I sat on the balcony long after Dan had gone to bed, the cool breeze doing little to calm my frayed nerves. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving, a reflection of the turmoil in my heart. I didn't hear Ethan approach until he was standing beside me. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I didn't look at him. "You shouldn't be here." "I know." He hesitated, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he added, "But I couldn't let the night end like this." I turned to him then, and for a moment, all the walls I had built came crashing down. The moonlight illuminated his face, the vulnerability in his eyes, and I felt the weight of everything we couldn't say. Without a word, I stood and walked inside, leaving him on the balcony as the waves continued their ceaseless dance against the shore. The days that followed brought a fragile, unspoken truce. Ethan kept his distance, but his presence lingered like the salt air, impossible to ignore. I tried to bury myself in the rhythms of daily life. Meals, walks along the cobblestone streets of the village, stolen moments of solitude by the sea. But there were cracks in my resolve, moments when my mind wandered back to the way he had looked at me, the raw honesty in his voice when he said he couldn't help how he felt. And deep down I knew I couldn't pretend either. One afternoon, Dan announced he had plans to meet some local guides in the village to arrange a boat tour. "It's not really your kind of thing," he said to me with a shrug. I nodded, grateful for the excuse to stay behind. "I'll rest here. It's been a long week." When Dan left, the villa felt achingly quiet, the distant sound of waves amplifying the stillness. I sat on the terrace with a book, trying to read, but the words blurred on the page. Then Ethan appeared, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. "You looked like you could use this," he said, setting one down beside me. "Thank you," I replied, my voice soft. He didn't leave. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat across from me, his presence both familiar and charged. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the rustle of the breeze and the distant cries of seagulls. "I've missed this," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "Missed what?" "Talking to you. Being close to you." He hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "Before everything got complicated." I set the book down, folding my hands in my lap. "It doesn't have to be complicated, Ethan. You're my son. That's enough." "But it's not," he said, his gaze steady. "Not for me." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to deny it, to push him away again, but the truth was I had missed him too. Not in the way he meant, perhaps, but in the way we used to laugh together, the way he used to confide in me, unguarded and trusting. "We can't go back," I said finally. "I know." There was a quiet resignation in his voice, but also something else, an understanding that made my heart ache. He wasn't asking for anything from me, not really. He just wanted to be seen, to be heard. We sat there in companionable silence for a while, the tension between us softening into something gentler. When the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sea in hues of gold and crimson, Ethan spoke again. "Do you remember when we first came here?" he asked. "I was 10, I think. Dad made us hike all the way up to that old monastery on the cliff." I smiled at the memory. "You complained the entire way up. But when we got to the top, you wouldn't stop talking about how beautiful the view was." He chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "I think that was the first time I really understood how much you loved the sea. You just stood there, staring at it like it was the most magical thing in the world." "It is magical," I said softly. "So are you," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him then, and for a moment the world seemed to fall away. There was no Dan, no villa, no restless sea. Just Ethan. His eyes filled with an honesty that left me breathless. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to fix this." "Maybe it doesn't need fixing," he said. "Maybe we just need to figure out what it means. Together." I shook my head, my heart heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. "We can't, Ethan. There are boundaries, lines we can't cross." "I'm not asking to cross them," he said. I need you to know how much you mean to me. That's all." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes. I reached across the table and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You mean the world to me too," I said, my voice breaking. "But it's too much." He nodded, his expression softening. "I understand. You do. But that doesn't change how I feel." We sat there, holding hands as the sun dipped below the horizon. The moment was bittersweet, a fragile connection amidst the chaos of emotions we couldn't fully control. When Dan returned later that evening, Ethan had gone to his room, and I was left alone on the terrace, staring out at the darkened sea. My heart felt like it was being pulled in two directions, toward the safety and certainty of the life I'd built with Dan, and toward the uncharted waters of whatever it was Ethan and I had become. I didn't know where we were headed, but I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same.
Bye.